Welcome to Revenge and Justice, where betrayal finally meets its reckoning. We share powerful first-person stories of men who were underestimated, betrayed, and pushed too far by family business partners and the people they trusted most. If you believe respect must be earned and betrayal always has a price, you've found your home. And now, today's story. For 45 years, I built this shop with my own two hands, believing every wrench turn was for my son's future. 8 days after his wedding, he walked in with a lawyer and gave me 72 hours to disappear. Then I found the insurance policy. He did not just want my money, he wanted me dead. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this story actually starts. The radio in my shop had been tuned to the same country station since 1983. Background noise that meant the world was still turning the way it was supposed to. I was standing over a 1965 Mustang convertible. The same one I had been standing over for 5 years, running my thumb along a weld seam on the rear quarter panel that still was not quite right. My name is August Lester. I am 72 years old, and I have owned Lester Auto and Restoration on Wyoming Street in Dayton, Ohio for 45 of those years. My father started this shop with 2 bays and a hand crank lift. I grew it to 6 bays and a waiting list 8 months long. I built engines for men who flew airplanes and men who drove garbage trucks, and I never once thought the work mattered more coming from one than the other. The Mustang belonged to my wife Marie, though she never got to see it finished. She bought it the year our son turned 10, rust eaten through the floor pans, engine seized solid, and called it her retirement project. Marie was a materials engineer who spent 20 years developing a rust-inhibiting coating that half the restoration shops in this country still use without knowing her name is on the patent. She died 5 years ago this past March, and the Mustang has sat in the corner bay ever since, 3/4 finished, waiting for hands not quite ready to finish it without her. I heard the tires on the gravel lot before I heard the engine cut off. A black Range Rover, the kind that costs more than most of my customers make in a year, parked crooked across 2 spaces like the lines did not apply to him. I set down my rag and walked toward the front of the shop, wiping grease from my knuckles, and I watched my son step out of the passenger side first, which told me something right there because Cohen never rode passenger in anything. Cohen liked to be the one deciding where everyone was going. The man who came out of the driver's seat wore a gray suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who have never done a day of physical work. And he carried a leather portfolio with the practiced ease of someone who used it more as a prop than a tool. Cohen introduced him as Zaire Glenn, an attorney, and I shook his hand and felt nothing in his grip. No calluses, no warmth. Just the soft handshake of a man who spent his life signing things other people had to live with. Dad, Cohen said, and he said it the way he used to say it when he was 17 and wanted the truck keys easy and warm on the surface with something underneath it. I had learned a long time ago not to trust. We need to talk about the shop. I have been talking about the shop for 45 years, I said. Come on in. We stood inside near the parts counter, and Zaire Glenn opened his portfolio and set a stack of papers on the counter between the invoice pads and the coffee can full of loose change. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply began speaking in the flat, rehearsed cadence of a man who delivered the same kind of news often enough that it had stopped meaning anything to him. Mr. Lester, he said, I am here regarding the transfer of ownership for this property and business, executed under a power of attorney granted to your son. The documentation is complete and has been filed with the county. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises and remove any personal property. I looked at the papers. Then I looked at my son. Cohen was studying the ceiling tiles the way a man studies something to avoid something else. I did not sign anything I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected it to, which surprised me because underneath my ribs, something had gone very still and very cold. The particular stillness I remembered from watching a crane cable snap on a job site 40 years ago. That half second before the sound catches up to the site. The signature is right there on page 4, Zaire said, tapping the page. Notarized, dated, entirely in order. I pulled the page toward me. There at the bottom was my name, August Lester, written in ink in a hand that looked enough like mine to fool a stranger. The capital A leaned the way my capital A leans. The The L had the small hook at the bottom I have made since I was a boy, learning cursive from nuns who cared more about penmanship than kindness. Whoever made this signature had studied my handwriting the way I study a worn bearing, looking for every detail that made it mine. But I had spent 45 years reading metal for cracks invisible to anyone who was not looking for them, and a signature is not so different from a weld. I leaned closer. The ink sat wrong. It pooled at the tail of the L in a place my pen never pools because my hand does not hesitate there. This hand had hesitated. This hand had thought about what it was doing. "Cohen," I said, still looking at the page, not looking at him. "When did I sign this?" "We talked about it," Dad, Cohen said. "Weeks ago. You said you wanted to slow down." I have never once said I wanted to slow down, and both of us knew it. Cohen did not answer me right away. He had learned somewhere between business school and whatever he did now with other people's money to let silence work for him instead of against him. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and let the quiet stretch, waiting to see whether I would fill it with an apology the way I always used to when he was young, and I felt guilty for something I had not yet figured out I had not done wrong. I did not fill it. I set the papers down on the parts counter and looked at Zaire Glenn instead. "I would like a copy of everything I said, every page." "That can be arranged," Zaire said, already reaching for a folder in his portfolio, the motion smooth and practiced. Cohen finally spoke. "Dad, this does not have to be difficult. We can talk about arrangements. There is a place, a really nice place, and I have already looked into it." "I am not going anywhere," I said flat and final, "not open for negotiation. Not today, not in 72 hours. I have work to finish." They left without another word, the Range Rover crunching back over the gravel lot. I watched the taillights disappear onto Wyoming Street before I moved. I locked the front bay door, which I had not done during business hours in longer than I could remember, and I walked back to the small office behind the parts counter, and I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk, where I kept a jeweler's loupe I had used for 30 years to inspect hairline fractures in crankshafts and connecting rods. I fitted the loupe over my eye and leaned down over the signature page until my nose nearly touched the paper. The capital A carried exactly the lean mine carries the particular forward tilt I picked up from my own father, who learned it from a shop teacher in 1951. The L had the hook. The spacing between my first and last name was correct, down to what looked like the width of a hair. Whoever did this had not simply copied my signature from an old check. They had studied it, practiced it, built it stroke by stroke, the way I would build an engine. Matching tolerances most people would never think to measure. But a man does not think about his own signature. His hand simply moves 45 years of muscle memory doing the work before the brain gets involved. What I was looking at through that loop had been drawn, not written. The ink pooled at the tail of the L in a place my pen has never pooled in my life, because my hand does not slow down there, does not hesitate, does not think. This hand had thought. This hand had been careful in a way that only a forger is careful. "You studied me," I said out loud to the empty office. "But you never watched me write." I straightened up and set the loupe on the desk, and I sat there for a moment with my hands flat on the wood, breathing slowly, the way I used to breathe before telling a customer their engine was not worth saving. Then I stood and walked to the tall metal filing cabinet in the corner, the one Marie always called my second wife, because I spent so much time organizing it, and I opened the bottom drawer where I kept things that were not business things that belonged only to me. Beneath a folder of old warranty claims, I found the white envelope with my name written across the front in Marie's handwriting. Small and precise. The handwriting of a woman who had spent 2 decades filling out patent applications in margins that did not leave room for a careless letter. She had given it to me 4 months before she died, pressed into my hand during her last hospital admission, and told me it was not a goodbye. "Just some things I want you to have in writing, August, for when you need them." I had read it twice in 5 years. Once the week after her funeral, sitting in my truck in this very parking lot, because I could not make myself walk inside. And once on the morning of Cohen's wedding, standing in a rented tuxedo in a church parking lot, wondering why I felt more alone watching my son get married than I had felt watching my wife's casket lowered into the ground. I unfolded the letter, now standing in the office with the loop still warm from my hand. August, she had written, "You have always been the most trusting man I have ever known. That is not a weakness, but remember this. The people who truly love you will never need to convince you to doubt your own mind. You have spent your whole life reading metal for the truth other people could not see. Trust that same eye when it comes to people." I folded the letter carefully and held it for a long moment. Then something in the back of my mind stirred some fact trying to surface, the way a bearing failure announces itself first as a sound before it becomes a breakdown. I looked at the date on the notary seal at the bottom of the forged power of attorney. June the 14th. June the 14th was the second day of the Blue Ridge Road Rally, the vintage car tour I had driven every year since Marie passed, 300 miles through Kentucky and Tennessee with 11 other men and their restored automobiles. No cell service through most of the mountain stretches. Evenings spent parked outside diners comparing engine notes. I had not been anywhere near a notary's office in Dayton, Ohio on June the 14th. I had been 600 miles away, sitting on the hood of a 1957 Chevrolet with a man named Zane Pittman, who happened, as it turned out, to be a licensed notary public himself. I set the forged document down on my desk and walked out to my truck, and I drove home with both hands on the wheel and my mind running the way it used to run when a customer brought me an engine that had failed under conditions that made no sense on paper. You do not chase the failure first. You chase the timeline, and the truth generally finds you on its own, once the timeline is solid enough to stand on. My house sat 4 miles from the shop, a plain brick ranch on Larchmont Avenue that Marie and I bought the year Cohen was born. And I had never wanted a bigger one, not even after Marie's patent check started arriving with numbers that still did not feel entirely real to me. I walked through the kitchen, past the calendar, still turned to March, and into the small den I used as an office, where a tall bookshelf held 40 years of catalogs and repair manuals. And on the middle shelf, a row of leather-bound logbooks I had kept every year since I was young enough to think a man ought to write down what he did with his days. I pulled the current logbook down and carried it to the desk and opened it to June. I do not keep a diary the way some men do, full of feelings and complaints. I keep a record the same way I keep a record on every engine that comes through my bay. Dates, mileage, weather, names of the men I traveled with. Marie used to tease me about it, calling it the least romantic form of memory keeping she had ever witnessed. And I used to tell her, a man's memory fails him eventually, but a well-kept logbook never does. June the 14th, second day of the Blue Ridge Road Rally. Departed Harrogate, Tennessee at 6:40 in the morning. 12 cars, 12 drivers. Overnight stop scheduled in Asheville, North Carolina. Weather clear, temperature climbing into the high 80s by noon. Stopped for lunch at a diner outside Newport, Tennessee, where I had written in my own hand, in ink that had faded only slightly over the weeks, since the name of every man who sat at that table with me. Spencer Johns, Milan Hammond, Abdullah Moses, and Zane Pittman, third from the end. Underlined twice, because Zane had spent 40 minutes that afternoon telling all of us about a notary business he ran on the side out of a strip mall office in Knoxville. A story that had gotten a good laugh out of the table, because Zane was the kind of man who could make even paperwork sound entertaining. I sat very still for a moment with my finger under his name. Zane Pittman was a licensed notary public in the state of Tennessee. And on June the 14th, the day the forged power of attorney claimed I had personally appeared before a notary in Ohio and signed away my shop and my house in that notary's physical presence, Zane Pittman had been sitting across a diner table from me in Newport, Tennessee, 400 miles from the address stamped at the bottom of that document. I flipped to the photographs tucked into the back cover of the logbook, printed at the drugstore the way I always did, because I never trusted anything I could not hold in my hand. There we were, 12 grown men standing in front of our cars in a gravel lot behind the diner, squinting into the same June sun, Zane, second from the left, with his arm slung over Spencer Johns's shoulder. The timestamp along the bottom edge read June 14th, 1:17 in the afternoon. Ohio law required physical presence for a notarization to be valid, because the entire purpose was for one human being to look another in the eye and confirm the signature belonged to a person who was actually there, actually consenting. Whoever notarized that power of attorney had either stolen a blank seal, fabricated one entirely, or paid off a notary willing to certify a signing that never happened. Either way, the document was not simply questionable. It was legally void from the moment the ink dried, no more force than a grocery list. I closed the logbook and sat with my hands flat on the desk, and I let myself feel for just a moment the particular anger that comes from understanding exactly how much planning had gone into hurting me. This was not a son acting on a sudden impulse of greed. Someone had studied my handwriting for weeks, maybe months. Someone had picked a date I would be unreachable out of cell range, unable to easily contradict the record. Someone had arranged for a stolen or forged notary seal and filed paperwork with the county, while I was still 600 miles away, with grease under my fingernails and no idea any of it was happening. Cohen had not done this alone, and I did not believe for 1 second that Zaire Glenn had dreamed it up either. A man like that drafted documents for a fee. Someone else had decided when, and someone else had decided how far this was going to go. I thought of Gwen, then my daughter-in-law married to my son for barely more than a week, and I remembered the way she had looked at me across the reception hall during the wedding toast. A look I had read at the time as simple nerves and had not thought much more about. Gwen had grown up 2 streets over from us, the daughter of a nurse and a machinist. A young woman who understood the value of an honest day's labor in a way I was not entirely sure my own son ever had. If Cohen had confided any part of this plan to anyone in his own household, it might have been her, whether she understood what she was hearing or not. I picked up the phone and dialed her number before I let myself think too hard about what to say. Because a man planning to catch a lie needs to move before his nerves talk him out of it. She answered on the 3rd ring. And before I said a word, I made myself do something I had not done in 40 years of running a business that depended on staying calm in front of upset customers. I let my hand shake just slightly, and I let that shake travel into my voice because the most convincing sound a broken thing makes is the one it cannot help making. "Gwen, honey," I said, and let the word catch in my throat. "It's August." "Dad." Her voice sharpened immediately, the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for a call like this without knowing it. "Is everything okay?" "I do not know," I said. "I am having some trouble." "Cohen came by the shop today with a lawyer. He says I signed something, papers about the shop, about the house. I do not remember signing anything, Gwen. I have been sitting here trying to think and I cannot place it." There was a pause on her end, short, but not nothing. The particular silence of a person doing quick arithmetic behind their eyes. "Cohen mentioned there were some papers," she said, finally. Careful in a way Gwen had never been careful with me before. "He said you had agreed to it, that it would be easier on everyone." "Easier, how?" I said. I let my voice waver on the second word, a hairline fracture, the kind you only hear if you are listening for it. "He said you talked about maybe getting some help," she said, "somewhere with people around in case anything happened. He said you brought it up yourself months ago." I never said that to anyone. I said, and this time I did not have to fake the confusion, because some of what I was feeling was genuine. Not confusion about the forgery, but confusion at how smoothly this story had apparently traveled through my own family, without a single person thinking to call and ask me directly. When did I supposedly say this? Gwen. Who was there? "I was not there for that conversation," she said. "Cohen told me about it afterward." "I am sorry, Dad. I really thought you two had talked it through together." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter with my free hand and kept my breathing audible, unsteady. A man coming apart at the seams, instead of a man closing in on the truth. "Where is this place?" I asked. "The place he wants to send me." Another pause, longer this time, long enough that I felt the shape of it the way I feel a bearing about to seize before it actually does. "I do not know the exact address," she said. "Cohen handled all of that. He said it is a private facility really well reviewed up near the state line somewhere. He said the transport team would come get you Monday morning." "Transport," I said quietly, mostly to myself, though the word carried down the line anyway. "That is just what he called it," Gwen said a little too quickly. "The van or whoever comes to help you move." "I think he meant it kindly, Dad. I think he is scared about you being alone in that house." I let a long, uneven breath out into the phone. The kind a man lets out when he has decided for the moment to stop fighting a current stronger than he is. "Okay," I said. "Okay, sweetheart. I am sorry to worry you with all this. I will try to get some rest." "We will figure it out together," she said, and her voice had softened into something that sounded almost like guilt, though I could not yet tell whether it was guilt over what she had done or guilt over what she suspected but had not let herself examine too closely. I ended the call and set the phone down on the counter and stood very still in my kitchen, looking out the window at the small vegetable garden Marie used to keep along the back fence, gone to weeds these last 2 summers, because I never had the heart to tend it the way she had. And I thought about the word transport. Not driver, not car service, not even the word ambulance, which at least would have implied medical necessity, some concern for my well-being beyond convenience. Transport was a word men used for cargo, for freight, for things that moved from one place to another without needing anyone's permission along the way. And my own son had used it in front of his wife without a flicker of hesitation, which told me something about how comfortable he had already become with the idea of me as an object to be relocated, rather than a father to be spoken with. I thought too about what Gwen had not said. She had not asked whether I was frightened. She had not offered to come sit with me the way she used to drop by after her shift at the hospital pharmacy just to talk shop about the vintage Bel Air I had been restoring for her father before he passed. She had recited what she had been told cleanly, and without much resistance, the way a person recites something they have decided is easier to believe than to question. But she also had not known the address. A wife planning to send her father-in-law somewhere against his will generally knows where that somewhere is. Gwen did not know, and something in the way she admitted it quickly, almost defensively, told me she had noticed the gap herself and had simply not let herself sit with it long enough to feel the shape of what it meant. Whether she believed the story Cohen had given her, or whether some part of her was only pretending to believe it because the alternative was too heavy to carry alone in that penthouse apartment, was something I did not know yet. But I filed it away carefully, the same way I filed away every reading on a diagnostic gauge that did not quite match the others, because sometimes the instrument that is slightly off tells you more than all the ones reading normal. I did not sleep that night, not in any way that counted as sleep. I lay in the bed Marie and I had shared for 38 years, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles in the dark, thinking about torque specs and timelines and the particular shade of green my son's eyes used to turn when he was a boy and someone at school had taken something from him that was not theirs to take. I got up before dawn, made coffee I did not drink, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. The one Cohen himself had bought me for Christmas 3 years ago, joking that a man my age had no business still doing his books on paper. I opened the banking app for the account I kept at Miami Valley Community Bank, the one I had used since before Cohen was born, the account that held 4 decades of careful deposits, a pension built slowly and stubbornly the way I built everything else in my life, one steady contribution at a time. The balance on the screen read $41.16. I sat very still and looked at it, the way I might look at a dial that had just told me something I did not want to believe, checking first whether my eyes had misread the number. They had not. I refreshed the page. The number held steady, small and mocking against a screen that had shown a balance north of $60,000 only 2 weeks earlier. I clicked through to the transaction history and scrolled to the top of the list. The most recent entry was dated 4 days earlier, an outgoing wire transfer in the amount of $59,200, sent to an account held by something called Cornerstone Family Care Holdings, based, according to the routing information, out of Columbus. The memo line read in the small clipped font banks use for everything, "Deposit for care placement services." I read those 5 words 3 times, and each time they meant the same thing a little more clearly. My son had reached into an account I had built dollar by dollar across 40 years of 6-day work weeks and holiday closures I never took, had drained it down to the change a man might find in a coat pocket, and had labeled the theft as an act of love. If a bank examiner or a county caseworker ever looked at this transaction, they would see a devoted son responsibly securing placement for an aging father. They would see care. They would not see what I was looking at, which was a man clearing out his father's life savings 4 days before serving him an eviction notice built on a forged signature. I thought about the gas leak. 3 weeks earlier, on a Wednesday, Cohen had shown up at the shop unannounced with takeout, saying he wanted to have lunch together, just the two of us, like old times. He had asked me partway through the meal to go check something on the compressor in the back bay, said he thought he heard it running rough. I had gone, spent nearly 20 minutes crouched behind the machine, listening for a knock that was not there. And when I came back into the office, the space heater under my desk, the one I only used in deep winter, was running full blast in the middle of July, filling the room with the smell of scorched dust. Cohen was gone. He had left without a word, and when he called that evening to check on me, his voice full of concern, I had actually apologized, embarrassed, telling him I must have bumped the switch without noticing. Sitting at my kitchen table now, with the drained account glowing on the screen, I understood exactly what that lunch had been. A rehearsal. A small controlled demonstration of forgetfulness, performed for an audience of one, designed to plant a seed of doubt about my own reliability, before anyone else needed convincing that the seed was real. He had been building this for longer than 3 weeks. I thought about the way he used to walk through the shop during visits, not looking at the cars, looking instead at the building itself, at the square footage, the way a man sizes up a property he intends to acquire, rather than a place he grew up playing in as a boy. He had asked almost offhand whether Marie's old patent work had ever generated real money, and I had given him the same vague answer I gave everyone: modest returns, nothing worth talking about, and he had nodded and let it drop. But he had asked. He had been looking for the seam in the wall even then. I closed the laptop and sat with my hands flat on the table, breathing the way I used to breathe standing over an engine that had thrown a rod, assessing damage before deciding what could still be saved. I was not going to call the police, not yet. If federal agents or county officers showed up at Cohen's door this morning, he would lawyer up before lunch. Zaire Glenn would shred whatever paperwork existed outside the official filing, and whoever ran Cornerstone Family Care Holdings would have every opportunity to disappear before anyone thought to ask them a single question. What I needed was someone who understood money the way I understood engines. Someone who could trace a wire transfer back through its shell companies the same way I traced an electrical short back to its source, one connection point at a time, until the whole faulty circuit revealed itself. I picked up the satellite phone I kept in the lockbox under my workbench, the one Marie's financial advisor had insisted I carry years ago for anything involving the trust, and I dialed a number I had not called in longer than I liked to admit. "Giovanna," I said, when she answered, sharp and awake despite the hour. "I need your help, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you tell me what you think I should do." I walked her through it start to finish, the same way I would walk a customer through a diagnostic report in order without embellishment. The forged power of attorney. The road rally alibi. The drained account and the wire transfer dressed up as a care deposit. Giovanna Wong had managed the trust Marie left behind for 5 years without a single misstep, and she listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always respected about her. "August," she said finally, "this is a lot to take in before my coffee. I need you to build me a financial picture," I said. "Everything on Cohen, his debts, his accounts, anything you can find without tipping anyone off that we are looking. And I need to know who is behind Cornerstone Family Care Holdings. I can have a preliminary report by tomorrow evening," she said. "Ghost protocols, nothing that pings back to him. August, are you safe right now?" "I am fine," I said, which was true in the way a bridge is fine, right up until the moment an inspector finds the crack that has been spreading under the paint for years. "I am not calling the police yet. If we move too soon, he panics, and I lose the chance to understand how deep this goes." "Understood," she said. "I will call you the moment I have something." I ended the call and sat at the table a long while after watching the sun come up, gray and slow, through the kitchen window. The same window Marie used to stand at every morning with her coffee, watching the birds work the feeder she kept filled year-round, even in winters cold enough to freeze the water dish solid. I had not filled that feeder once since she passed. The knock came around 9, 3 firm raps against the front door, and I knew who it was before I opened it, because Walter Santos had knocked on that door in exactly that rhythm for the better part of 26 years, ever since he moved into the house across Larchmont Avenue and introduced himself with a case of beer under one arm and a lawnmower part he needed help identifying under the other. "August," he said, standing on the porch in his Reds cap and the same canvas work jacket he wore regardless of the season, holding a foil-covered dish. "Rosa made too much again. She always makes too much." "Come on in, Walter," I said. He stepped into the front hall and set the dish on the entry table, then stood there for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking past me into the living room where I had, without quite deciding to, already stacked 2 empty moving boxes near the front window. Part instinct, part performance. The kind of thing a man does when he wants anyone watching from the street to believe he has already given up. "You got a minute?" he said. It was not really a question. Walter Santos did not waste words on things he was not certain about. He had spent 31 years running a machine shop 2 towns over before retiring. And men who spend that long around heavy equipment tend to develop a particular respect for precision, for saying exactly what happened and nothing more. "That black SUV yesterday morning," he said, "the one that pulled up behind your truck. I wrote it down because something about the whole thing felt off to me." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small spiral notebook, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at the hardware store, and flipped it open. "Your son's been out here more than usual this last month. August. I've been keeping track since the middle of June, because I saw him standing across the street one Saturday, just standing there with his phone up, taking pictures of the shop, like he was doing an appraisal for a bank." My chest went tight, though I kept my face the way I kept it during Zaire Glenn's visit, still and unreadable. "How many times?" I asked. "4 that I counted," Walter said. "Once alone walking the property line out back, like he was measuring something. Twice with another fellow in a suit, the same one who was here yesterday, if I had to guess. And once he had a woman with him, younger, took photographs too, though she looked less comfortable doing it than he did." I took the notebook from his outstretched hand and looked at his careful block printing dates in the left margin, times beside them brief descriptions written the way a man writes an inventory. No wasted words. June 11th, June 18th, June 23rd, July 2nd. "I need you to keep this up, Walter," I said. "Write down anything else you see. And there is something I need to ask you, something serious, and I need you to trust me on it, without asking why just yet." Walter looked at me for a long moment, his eyes steady the way they had always been steady. The eyes of a man who had spent 3 decades learning to read the difference between a machine that was about to fail and one that only sounded like it might. "Whatever you need, August," he said. "You know where I am." "Monday morning," I said. "If you see anything unusual outside my house, any vehicles, any strangers, I need you to stay inside. Do not come over. Do not get involved. Just watch and remember what you see." "That bad?" he said. Not a question this time either. "It might be," I said, "but I am handling it." He studied me a moment longer, then nodded once the way men of a certain generation nod when they have decided a conversation has reached the end of what it is going to give them, and he turned and walked back across the street toward his own porch, leaving me standing in my doorway with his notebook still open in my hand, 4 dates staring back up at me, each one another brick in a wall my son had been building for weeks before he ever knocked on my door. I spent that night in the garage, not sleeping, going through the metal toolbox where I kept things that were not tools. A small wooden case Marie's father had given her when she graduated engineering school, its hinges gone stiff with age, still holding the drafting instruments she had used to sketch her earliest coding formulas on graph paper at our kitchen table. Cohen had asked about that case once, years ago, said he might like to have it someday. This was not the occasion I had imagined giving it to him, but it was a good enough excuse to walk through his front door. I also found in the same drawer where I kept spare fuses and shop rags, 2 audio recorders the size of a shirt button, purchased years back from a security catalog for a job that had needed discreet monitoring of a warehouse loading dock, forgotten ever since. 96 hours of battery each, adhesive backing strong enough to hold beneath furniture through a season of vacuuming. I tested both against my palm until the small green light blinked steady, then dropped them into my shirt pocket alongside the wooden case. The drive to Columbus took just under an hour, and I spent most of it thinking about the last time I had visited Cohen and Gwen's building a glass tower downtown, with a doorman who called every resident by name, and a lobby that smelled faintly of eucalyptus. Nothing like the smell of solvent and hot metal I had breathed every working day of my life. I had called ahead, my voice pitched soft and unsteady, telling Cohen I had found something of his mother's he ought to have. He answered the door himself, dressed for a day that clearly did not involve physical labor. A fitted shirt with the sleeves rolled, with the kind of precision that takes effort to look effortless. "Dad," he said, and the word came out smooth, warm on the surface, the same tone he had used at the shop 2 days earlier, before handing me a tissue paper-wrapped threat. I held up the wooden case. "Your mother's drafting set," I said. "I thought you should have it." Something moved across his face, quick and unreadable, gone before I could name it. He stepped back and let me in, and I noted the way I note a tool left out of place in my own shop, that he did not thank me, did not open the case, simply set it on the entry table, the way Zaire Glenn had set that manila envelope on my porch. An object handled rather than received. Gwen appeared from the kitchen in workout clothes, her hair pulled back, and her face did something honest and complicated when she saw me. Relief and guilt arriving at the same time. "Dad," she said, and crossed the room to hug me, and I let myself hold on to that a beat longer than necessary. Because whatever role she had played in this, some part of her still felt like family, still felt like the girl who used to ask me questions about carburetors on her bicycle. Cohen's phone rang before I had even sat down. He glanced at the screen and his jaw tightened, and he told Gwen he needed to take it in his office, already walking away before she answered, already speaking into the phone in a low, clipped voice I could not make out from the living room. I did not waste the opening. I told Gwen I needed the restroom, and she pointed me down the hall past a home office with the door standing half open, 3 monitors glowing on a glass desk, Cohen pacing behind it with his back to me, one hand pressed flat against his forehead. I moved into the guest bathroom across the hall, closed the door most of the way, and reached beneath the porcelain shelf that ran along the back wall. A narrow, dark space, perfect for holding something no one would think to search. I pressed the first recorder against the underside of the shelf and held it firm for a count of 10, feeling the adhesive catch and hold. Back in the living room, I lowered myself carefully onto one knee beside the long sectional sofa, my hand pressed to the armrest the way a man my age genuinely needs to steady himself, and I reached beneath the frame until my fingers found the wooden crossbeam running along the base. The second recorder went there, pressed flat, held until it caught. I was back on my feet, breathing normally, examining a framed photograph on the far wall when Cohen returned. It showed the 3 of us, Marie, Cohen, and me, standing in front of the shop the summer he turned 10, all of us squinting into July sun, Marie laughing at something outside the frame. "Your mother looks happy there," I said, and I let my voice carry the specific weight of a man missing his wife, which cost me nothing to perform because it happened to be entirely true. Cohen glanced at the photograph the way a man glances at a stranger's vacation pictures, polite and unmoved. "Yeah," he said, "she does." I stayed 20 minutes longer, long enough to seem unhurried, long enough to watch my son check his phone 4 separate times without once looking at me the way he used to when he was small and wanted my attention. And when I finally rose to leave, I told him I loved him, and I meant it, in the way you can still love a wound you are actively treating. And he said it back, the way a man says a phrase he has stopped feeling, but has not stopped saying. I drove home with both recorders' twin receivers riding on the passenger seat, and somewhere around the county line, I finally let my hands shake for real. No longer a performance, just an old man who had spent the morning smiling at his own son and calling it strategy. The receiver units were smaller than a deck of cards, matte black plastic with a single frequency dial and a headphone jack. The same kind of equipment I had once used to catch a warehouse manager skimming inventory off a loading dock 20 years back. I had not thought about that job in a decade, and it struck me, sitting alone in my den that night, with the overhead light off and only the small green power indicator glowing in the dark. That I had spent my whole working life learning to listen for the sound of something failing before it broke completely. And that skill had somehow become the only weapon left to me now. I fitted the headphones over my ears and turned the dial to the channel assigned to the bathroom unit, the one closer to Cohen's home office. And for several minutes, there was nothing but the soft electrical hiss of an empty room. I sat with that patience I had built over 40 years of waiting for a diagnosis to reveal itself. The kind of stillness that does not come naturally to most men, but comes easily to anyone who has spent a career listening for the difference between a normal engine and one about to fail. Then a door slammed sharp through the headphones, followed by the rapid percussion of dress shoes crossing hardwood. I recognized the rhythm before I placed the voice. Cohen paced when he was under pressure, a habit I had noticed at family dinners without ever naming it, the way he would rise from the table on some excuse and circle the perimeter of a room like a man checking a fence line. I had always taken it for restless energy. Listening to the accelerating tempo of his footsteps through a hidden microphone, I understood it differently now. It was the pacing of something caged. A cabinet door opened. Ice hit glass. Liquid poured fast and heavy, more than a measured drink. "Come on," Cohen muttered to himself. "Come on, come on." His phone rang once before he answered. "Yeah, it's me," he said, and his voice had dropped completely out of the register he used with family, replaced by something flat and pressurized, the voice of a man doing math he did not like the answer to. The transfer went through. 59. I know it is not the full amount. That is why I am calling. A pause. I sat forward, elbows on the desk, headphones pressed tight. "I understand the timeline," Cohen said. "I am telling you the house and the shop close by Friday. The equity clears by the following Wednesday at the absolute latest." Another pause, longer this time. When Cohen spoke again, something had slipped out from beneath the confident surface. A thinness in his voice I had never once heard from him in 38 years as his father. "I know what happens if it is not there," he said. "You do not need to explain that to me again." He ended the call. The pacing resumed, faster now. 72 hours, he said, under his breath, not to anyone, just to the walls of a room he apparently believed was empty. 72 hours, and it is done. The office door opened. A second set of footsteps entered, lighter, and the acoustic quality shifted enough that I understood the second person had stepped fully into the room. Zaire Glenn's voice followed thinner through the small speaker than it had sounded standing across my parts counter, but unmistakable. "Monday is confirmed," Cohen said. 8 in the morning. Transport arrives at the house. The old man thinks he is signing over to a standard placement. He will not resist. "And the facility," Zaire said. "Everything squared away on their end. 2,000 deposit wired last week through the holding account," Cohen said. They confirmed receipt. "Room's ready whenever we need it." "Cohen," Zaire's voice dropped careful. "I need to be clear about what I am agreeing to here. I handled the documentation, the power of attorney, the transfer, the notary seal. That is the extent of my involvement. Whatever happens after that is separate from me." "You are in this," Cohen said, flat and final. "You have been in this since you stamped that seal. Let's not waste time drawing lines that do not exist anymore." A long silence on Zaire's end. "What is this place?" he finally asked. "The facility." "It is a private care operation," Cohen said. "North of Springfield, out past the county line, no licensed physicians on staff, no state reporting requirements, no visitor logs kept on file. Families use places like this when they need someone relocated quietly without a paper trail following behind them." I sat perfectly still in my dark office, my hands flat on the desk in front of me, and I was distantly aware that they were not shaking, which surprised me, because I had expected something physical to happen inside my own body. At hearing my son describe in the flat, clinical language of a man discussing a shipping contract the disposal of his own father. "And the outcomes there," Zaire said, his voice tight now, careful in a different way than before. "For someone August's age, what are they typically?" I did not hear Cohen's answer yet. The recording clicked forward the receiver's small readout, showing another 11 minutes remained on that segment, and I understood, sitting alone in the dark with Marie's letter still fresh in my mind, That whatever came next was the reason I had climbed onto my knees on another man's bathroom floor to plant a microphone in the first place. I reached for the volume dial and turned it up. For someone his age, Cohen's recorded voice continued flat and unhurried. The physical stress of relocation, combined with the sedation protocol they use to keep residents calm and compliant, tends to produce cardiac events fairly reliably. The staff there are experienced, handling the paperwork that follows. Death certificate gets filed as natural causes, no autopsy requested, no police involvement. The whole operation is built to produce that outcome cleanly. I sat with my hands flat on the desk and listened to my son describe my death the way he might describe a maintenance schedule for a piece of equipment nearing the end of its useful life. And somewhere underneath my ribs, the cold, still feeling from 2 days earlier returned, deeper, now settling in for what I understood was going to be a long stay. A timeline, Zaire said. His voice had thinned out further, the sound of a man watching a door close somewhere behind him. How long are we talking? A month, Cohen said. Probably less. He is 72. His cholesterol numbers alone would convince most doctors he is a walking liability. We are not inventing anything a coroner would find suspicious. We are just moving the schedule forward a little. I reached up without deciding to, and pressed 2 fingers flat against my own sternum, not because my heart was racing, but because I needed in that moment some physical proof that it was still doing its job, still keeping its own schedule, regardless of what my son had planned for it. The beat came back steady under my fingers, unhurried, almost insulting in how ordinary it felt. There is one more piece, Cohen said. The insurance. What insurance, Zaire said, and for the first time, his voice carried something closer to alarm than caution. 4 months ago, Cohen said, using the power of attorney and a set of medical evaluations our contact put together, I took out a life insurance policy on him through a private underwriter based out of Delaware. $9 million. Payout triggers on natural death occurring in a licensed care setting. The facility issues the death certificate. We file the claim. Money clears into the holding account within 60 days. The sound Zaire made was not quite a word, more a breath forced out through his nose. The particular sound of a man realizing the size of the hole he has already fallen into. $9 million clears the Detroit debt entirely. Cohen went on, his voice, picking up a rhythm now, something almost enthusiastic underneath the flatness. The tone of a man walking a colleague through a business plan he was proud of. Better than $2 million left over after that to rebuild clean. We lose the penthouse for a while, maybe the second car, but we come out the other side solvent. This is the only path that actually works, Zaire. The shop and the house alone do not cover what I owe. I sat in the dark with my fingers still pressed against my chest, and I thought about Marie's letter, folded now in the top drawer of this very desk. Her handwriting small and precise, telling me that the people who love you never need to convince you to doubt your own mind. I thought about 11 years of double shifts so Cohen could go to college without loans hanging over him. I thought about teaching him to check oil on a 1970 Camaro in this very garage when he was 12 years old. His hands too small for the dipstick. His face lit up with a kind of pride I had not seen on him in longer than I wanted to admit. Not since money and ambition had replaced whatever used to sit underneath them. $9 million. My son had looked at what remained of my life and arrived at a number, had arranged the underwriting and hired the facility and wired the deposit, had done all of it while sitting across a Sunday dinner table from me 2 weeks earlier, passing the mashed potatoes and asking politely about the Mustang's timing belt. The recording ran another few minutes, Cohen and Zaire working through logistics. I forced myself to keep listening to, even as something in my chest wanted to stand up and walk out of that dark office and never come back. The transport company. The timing of the notification to Gwen kept deliberately vague, according to Cohen, because she asks too many questions when she has real information to work with. She does not know about any of this, Zaire said. Not really. She knows what she needs to know, Cohen said. She signs what I put in front of her, and she does not ask the right questions. That is what I need her to be right now, a functional piece of the structure. I pressed the pause button on the receiver and sat very still in the dark. And for the first time since Cohen had walked into my shop with a stranger and a stack of forged paper, I let myself feel something other than the cold, controlled stillness I had been maintaining since the moment I first looked at that signature through a jeweler's loupe. I did not cry. I did not shake. What moved through me instead was something closer to clarity. The particular kind of clarity that arrives only after every remaining uncertainty has been burned away, leaving nothing behind but the plain shape of the work still in front of me. I reached into the desk drawer and took out the satellite phone, the same one Marie's advisor had insisted I carry for anything involving the trust. And I dialed Giovanna Wong for the second time that week. She answered on the first ring this time, which told me she had been half expecting the call, or perhaps had simply not been asleep, the way people who manage other people's fortunes rarely sleep the way ordinary men do. "August," she said. "It's late even for you. I need you to listen to something I said. I need you to not interrupt me until I am finished. And I need you to understand that what I am about to describe is not a hypothetical." "Go ahead," she said, and something in her voice had already shifted into the careful alert register she used when a number on a spreadsheet did not match the number it was supposed to match. I told her everything. The recording from the bathroom microphone, Cohen's voice describing the sedation protocol, the private facility with no licensed physicians and no visitor logs, the $9 million life insurance policy taken out on my life using the same forged power of attorney that had already stolen my bank account. I described it the way I would describe a structural failure to a review board, in sequence, without embellishment. Because emotion was a luxury I could not afford in front of Giovanna if I wanted her thinking clearly alongside me. When I finished, the line was quiet for 4 full seconds. "August," she said finally, and her voice had lost its usual composure, gone thin and hard at the edges. "What you have just described is premeditated murder for financial gain. This stopped being a wire fraud matter the moment he said the word sedation. I am calling the FBI field office in Columbus tonight. My legal team can have this in front of a judge by morning." "No," I said. "August, listen to me, Giovanna." I kept my voice level, the same tone I used with an apprentice who was about to make an expensive mistake with a torque wrench. "If federal agents show up at Cohen's door tonight, he lawyers up before sunrise. Zaire Glenn disappears, every scrap of documentation that is not already filed with the county. That facility gets a phone call and clears out its rooms before anyone can subpoena a single record. And the insurance policy, the one piece of evidence that proves intent beyond any argument about misunderstanding, becomes something a defense attorney spends 3 years arguing was never really meant seriously. I am not handing this to a court calendar that moves at the speed of a filing cabinet. I am handling it myself." Another silence, longer this time. The kind that meant she was already working the problem the way she worked every problem, taking it apart into pieces small enough to solve one at a time. "Tell me what you need," she said. "I need the forensic accounting you started building on him," I said. "Everything. Every account, every debt, every credit line. And I need the full picture on whoever is behind Cornerstone Family Care Holdings." "I already have most of it," she said, and I heard her keyboard clicking somewhere on her end pages opening. Cohen Lester's financial situation is significantly worse than what appeared on the surface. He is not simply overextended, he is functionally insolvent. His brokerage firm shows almost no verified client accounts on the books, which suggests it exists primarily to justify loan applications rather than to generate actual revenue. Both his and Gwen's joint credit history shows aggressive borrowing over the past 2 years. Several accounts opened without what looks like her direct knowledge. "And the primary debt," I said. "A lending group operating out of Detroit," she said. "Private syndicate, not a bank. The number I am seeing is 4.1 million borrowed against increasingly desperate terms as his other options closed off. The interest structure is predatory, compounding weekly, and the deadline attached to it lines up almost exactly with what you just told me about Monday." I stood up from my desk and walked to the window, looking out at Larchmont Avenue, gone dark and quiet. Walter Santos's porch light glowing steady across the street the way it had every night for 26 years. "Giovanna," I said, "I want you to buy that debt." A pause. "I am sorry. The Detroit syndicate holds 4.1 million in promissory notes against my son," I said. "I want you to reach out through intermediaries, no connection back to me or the trust, and offer them a full buyout of the principal, plus accrued interest. Tonight, if it can be arranged that fast. Why, Giovanna said, though. I could hear in her voice that she already suspected the answer and simply wanted to hear me say it out loud. Because right now, I said my son owes $4 million to men in Detroit who will break his kneecaps to collect it. After tonight, if this goes the way I want it to, he will owe that same $4 million to me. I will become his only creditor. I will hold every piece of leverage he has spent the last year terrified of losing. And unlike the men he owes it to now, I will be able to use that leverage inside a federal courtroom instead of a back alley. The line went quiet again, but this time I recognized the quality of the silence, the sound of a professional building a plan in real time. It would need to route through at least 3 shell entities, she said slowly, to keep any trace from leading back to the Lester family trust. The syndicate will not care who the buyer is as long as the wire clears. Groups like that acquire and sell debt packages constantly. They will sign the assignment paperwork without asking many questions. How fast? I said. Wire transfer within the hour, she said. Assignment paperwork executed before sunrise if my contact in Detroit is still willing to move at this pace, which for the right premium, he generally is. Do it, I said. I did not sleep after that call, though I tried lying on top of the covers in my clothes with the satellite phone resting on my chest, the way a man sleeps when he is waiting for something, rather than resting from it. Every hour or so, I checked the screen, and every hour or so there was nothing, and I lay in the dark of that bedroom Marie and I had shared for 38 years, listening to the house settle around me the way it always did. Boards contracting slightly as the July heat finally broke sometime after midnight. Giovanna called back at 2:14 in the morning. The intermediary made contact, she said, without any greeting at all, which told me she understood exactly how little patience I had left for pleasantries. The Detroit group is willing to talk. They have done this kind of transaction before. Buyers acquiring distressed debt packages at a discount to avoid the collection process themselves. From their perspective, it looks like a straightforward business opportunity. A shell entity willing to pay 85 cents on the dollar for paper they might otherwise have to chase down the hard way. What do they want? I asked. Full payment wired before they will release the assignment documents, she said. $3.48 million, structured through the corporation I set up 2 years ago for exactly this kind of situation, routed through a second entity in Delaware before it reaches them. Nothing traces back to the Lester name at any point of the chain. Do it, I said again, the same 2 words I had said 3 hours earlier, because there was nothing else left to say, and every additional word felt like time I did not have to spend. I stayed awake through the transfer, sitting now at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me, watching the black rectangle of window above the sink slowly turn from full dark to the deep blue that comes an hour or so before actual sunrise. I thought about Cohen as a boy, maybe 9 years old, standing in that same kitchen, asking me why some engines knocked and others ran smooth. Genuinely curious in a way that had nothing to do with money or leverage, just a boy who liked understanding how things worked. I did not know exactly when that boy had stopped existing, or whether he had ever really existed the way I remembered him, or whether memory simply softens a person over enough years until you can no longer tell what was true and what you needed to be true. Giovanna called again at 4:51. It is done, she said. The wire cleared at 4:32. The Detroit group signed the assignment paperwork electronically 12 minutes ago, transferring all rights, title, and interest in the promissory notes to the holding corporation. As of this moment, the $4.1 million your son owes no longer belongs to a lending syndicate in Michigan. It belongs through 3 layers of shell ownership to you. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over, the way I used to turn over a rebuilt carburetor before bolting it back onto an engine, checking each connection one final time before trusting it to hold under pressure. Does he know yet? I asked. No, she said, and he will not know until you decide he should. The Detroit group has no reason to notify him of anything. From his side of the ledger, nothing has changed. He still believes he owes the same amount to the same people under the same deadline. He has no idea the hand holding that debt has changed. Good, I said. There is something else you should know, Giovanna said, and her voice shifted into a different register, now more careful. the tone she used when a piece of information mattered enough that she wanted to make certain I heard it clearly. The forensic team finished the deeper trace on Cornerstone Family Care Holdings overnight. It is a shell operation registered in Nevada, but the actual facility itself, the physical building, sits just north of Springfield, exactly where the recording placed it. Public records show it operating under a different name for the past 6 years, cited twice by county health inspectors for unlicensed operation before simply changing its business filing and continuing to run. There is no indication it has ever had a licensed physician on staff. I closed my eyes for a moment, standing in my own kitchen in the gray light before dawn, and let myself feel briefly the full weight of how close this had actually come to working. Not a hypothetical threat dressed up in dramatic language. A functioning operation with a track record. A facility that had apparently done this before, for other families, other fathers, other mothers, who trusted the wrong person with the wrong kind of power over their final years. "We need the FBI now," I said. "Not eventually, now." "I agree," Giovanna said. "I can have my contact reach out to the field office in Columbus this morning. Given what you have, the recording, the forged documents, the financial trail, they will move quickly. But August, I need to say this clearly. Once federal agents are involved, this is no longer something you can fully control. There will be a warrant, an arrest, a process that follows its own timeline, regardless of what either of us wants." "I understand," I said. "I am not looking to control it anymore. I am looking to end it cleanly, the way you finish a repair once every part has finally been accounted for." Giovanna called back at 8:15 that morning, after I had showered and forced down a piece of toast I did not taste sitting at my kitchen table, watching the sun climb over the fence line where Marie's roses used to grow, before I let them go to seed 2 summers back. Too busy grieving to keep something alive that needed daily attention. "The Columbus field office is engaged," she said. "I spoke directly with a supervising agent this morning after my legal team submitted the documentation package overnight. The recording, the forged power of attorney, the wire transfer records, the information on Cornerstone Family Care Holdings. They moved faster than I expected, which tells me they take this seriously." "What happens now?" I asked. "2 special agents will come to your house today to review everything in person and coordinate a plan," she said. "Given the severity of what is in that recording, and given that your son is already scheduled Monday as the date for both the eviction and the placement, they want to move quickly. I would expect them within the hour." They arrived at 9:40, a plain gray sedan pulling into my driveway, with none of the theater Cohen and Zaire had brought 2 days earlier. Just 2 people stepping out with the unhurried economy of professionals who had done this exact thing many times before and understood that hurrying rarely improved an outcome. The woman introduced herself first. Special Agent Alana Shaw, mid-40s, dark hair pulled back tight, a leather folio under one arm that she carried the way a person carries something they actually intend to use rather than display. Beside her stood Special Agent Christopher Calhoun, taller, quieter, the kind of stillness that came from a man who had learned early in his career that most useful information in a room arrives through watching rather than talking. "Mr. Lester," Agent Shaw said, shaking my hand with a grip that told me she was not going to waste my time with softness I had not asked for. "We have reviewed everything Ms. Wong's team submitted. I want to say up front that this is one of the more disturbing elder exploitation cases I have handled in 11 years with the Bureau, and I intend for us to handle it correctly the first time." We sat at the kitchen table, and Agent Calhoun opened a laptop and played back a portion of the recording I had already given Giovanna's team. Confirming the audio quality, confirming the voices matched samples they had already pulled from Cohen's public business appearances online. "This is admissible," Agent Shaw said once the playback finished. "Ohio is a one-party consent state for audio recording, and you were lawfully present in that apartment when you placed the devices. Combined with the financial documentation and the forged power of attorney, we have more than enough for arrest and search warrants covering your son Zaire Glenn and the operators of the Springfield facility." "And the timeline?" I asked. "Cohen believes Monday is still the day everything moves forward on his end. I would like to use that." Agent Calhoun looked up from the laptop for the first time. "You want him to walk into this believing he has already won?" "I want him standing in my shop," I said, in front of everyone involved, when he finds out otherwise. Not in a courtroom 8 months from now where his lawyer gets to control the narrative. I want it to happen where he thought he was in charge. Agent Shaw exchanged a look with her partner, the kind of silent communication that comes from years of working together. And then she nodded slowly. "That is workable," she said. "We can have agents positioned nearby without visible presence until you signal. Given that he is expecting to serve you an eviction notice and coordinate a transport pickup, we can time our entry to coincide with that moment when he and Zaire Glenn are both physically present and the paper trail is actively in motion." "What about Gwen?" I asked. "My daughter-in-law. I do not believe she understands the full scope of what her husband has done." Based on what is in the recording, Agent Shaw said she may have exposure related to some of the financial documents she signed. But the recording also suggests Cohen deliberately kept her uninformed about the most serious elements. If she cooperates, once this becomes clear to her, that will factor significantly into how any charges against her are handled, if charges are even warranted at all. I sat with that for a moment, thinking of Gwen's face in the doorway of that penthouse. The honest, complicated relief and guilt arriving together when she saw me standing there with a wooden case in my hands. "We will need you present, but positioned safely," Agent Calhoun said, "once the warrants are executed Monday morning. You will not be alone in that shop. We will have agents inside before your son and his attorney arrive, staged out of immediate sight." I looked at both of them, this woman and this quiet, careful man who had walked into my kitchen an hour after Giovanna's call and had already built in the space of that single conversation a plan more precise than anything I could have assembled on my own. "Monday morning," I said, 8 o'clock. That is when he told Zaire the transport would arrive. "Then, that is when we move," Agent Shaw said, closing her folio with a decisive snap. "Get some rest this weekend, Mr. Lester. You are going to need it." I almost laughed at that, the idea of rest, but I thanked her instead, and I walked them both back out to their car. And I stood in my driveway a long moment after they pulled away, looking at the shop across town in my mind's eye, the Mustang still sitting 3/4 finished in the corner bay, waiting the way it had been waiting for 5 years for something I was finally close enough to name. The weekend passed the way I imagined the hours pass for a man waiting on test results, technically full of ordinary tasks and somehow entirely empty at the same time. I opened the shop Saturday morning out of habit more than necessity, turned wrenches on a customer's transmission I could have rebuilt blindfolded, and found myself standing more than once in front of the Mustang, running my palm along the cool metal of the hood the way another man might rub a worn coin for luck. Walter Santos came by twice, once with more of Rosa's cooking, and once just to sit on my porch steps and talk about nothing in particular. Baseball scores and the price of gas, and a fence post that needed replacing on his side of the property line. And I understood he was doing what good neighbors do when they sense something heavy sitting on a friend's shoulders but cannot ask directly what it is. I did not tell him about Monday. I only reminded him again to stay inside if he saw anything unusual, and he studied me the way he had before and let it go without pushing. Giovanna called twice more over the weekend, once to confirm the final language on the debt assignment paperwork, now sitting quietly in a Delaware holding corporation with my name nowhere visible on it. And once simply to ask how I was doing, a question I answered honestly for once, instead of performing composure I did not entirely feel. Sunday night, I laid out my suit. It hung in the back of my closet, in a cedar-scented garment bag, charcoal gray wool, the same suit I had worn to Marie's funeral 5 years earlier, and to Cohen's wedding 8 days before all of this began. The only suit I owned, because a man who spends his life in coveralls does not need more than one good suit, if he chooses it carefully. I unzipped the bag part way and let my hand rest against the fabric, still holding its shape after years of careful storage. And I thought about the last time I had worn it, watching Cohen slide a ring onto Gwen's finger, and telling myself the uncomfortable feeling low in my chest was simply a father's natural grief at watching his only son build a life with no room left in it for him. I had been wrong about the source of that feeling. It had not been ordinary grief. Some part of me, some old instinct built over decades of listening to engines and reading the small warnings metal gives before it fails completely, had already known something was wrong long before I had proof of it. I pressed my dress shirt with the iron Marie had bought 30 years ago, a heavy old thing that still worked better than anything sold new. And I polished my black Oxfords at the kitchen table, the same shoes I had worn to her funeral and to more occasions in my life than I cared to count. The ones that required me to be my best and steadiest self. I opened the top drawer of my desk and took out Marie's letter, unfolded it one more time under the lamp, and read it slowly, the way she had written it, paying attention to every word, the way she had paid attention to everything in her life. August, you have always been the most trusting man I have ever known. That is not a weakness. But remember this, the people who truly love you will never need to convince you to doubt your own mind. You have spent your whole life reading metal for the truth other people could not see. Trust that same eye when it comes to people. I folded the letter carefully along its worn creases and slid it into the inside breast pocket of the suit jacket, close against where my heart would sit once I put it on. And I turned off the desk lamp and stood a long moment in the dark den, listening to the house settle around me the way it had settled every night for 45 years. Boards contracting, the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen, all the small mechanical sounds of a life still running, even when everything inside it had changed. I did not sleep well, though I did sleep some, and I was up before the alarm, dressed by 6:45, the suit fitting exactly as I remembered it, the wool settling across my shoulders with the particular quiet authority of something built to last. Built the way I had always tried to build things, with care and attention, and a refusal to cut corners that would eventually show themselves under pressure. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window drinking it, watching the empty space along the back fence where Marie's roses used to bloom every July without fail. And I thought, not for the first time that week, about how much of a life gets built out of small daily maintenance that nobody notices until it stops happening. At 7:25, I heard the low rumble of a commercial moving truck slowing on Larchmont Avenue, and I set my coffee cup down on the counter and walked to the front window, keeping myself back from the glass the way I had learned to over the past several days, watching without being watched. The truck pulled to the curb 2 houses down, exactly where I had told Agent Shaw it would likely stop, out of direct view, but close enough for a fast approach. Behind it, a silver sedan I recognized as Zaire Glenn's pulled in, and behind that, Cohen's black car eased to a stop directly in front of my house, parking with the same crooked confidence he always brought to spaces that were not entirely his to claim. I straightened my tie in the hallway mirror one final time, buttoned my jacket, and felt the folded weight of Marie's letter settle against my chest like something alive. 3 knocks sounded at my front door. Hard confident the particular knock of a man who believed the door already belonged to him, I walked toward it. I opened the door and found the 3 of them arranged on my porch the way they had arranged themselves at the shop 5 days earlier. Zaire Glenn in front this time, with his leather portfolio already open against his forearm. Cohen a half step behind him in a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who have never once questioned whether they deserve to wear one. And behind them both, hanging back near the porch steps, Gwen, wearing a light jacket that made no sense in the July heat, her arms crossed low over her stomach, the way a person holds themselves when they are trying to keep something from spilling out. Mr. Lester Zaire said, and his voice carried the same rehearsed authority it had carried at the shop. A man accustomed to rooms where his word functioned as the final word. Pursuant to the notice served last week, your vacate period has expired as of 8 o'clock this morning. This property is legally transferred, and you no longer hold any right of occupancy. The transport team is prepared to assist with relocation, and the moving crew outside will handle any remaining items you leave behind. Every word I said, and I stepped back from the doorway the way a man steps back to let something walk fully into a trap it has already chosen for itself. Come in. Zaire blinked, clearly having expected resistance rather than an open door. But he recovered quickly and stepped inside, portfolio still tucked against his arm. Cohen followed, and Gwen came last, and when she crossed the threshold of the house she had visited a dozen times over the past 3 years, She paused for just a moment, her hand brushing the doorframe the way a person touches something they are trying to remember the shape of. I closed the door behind them and walked to the small table beside my recliner where I had set a manila folder the night before, and I picked it up and held it out toward Zaire rather than Cohen, because I had learned enough over the past 5 days to understand exactly which of these two men would crack first under pressure. Before we go any further, I said I would like you to look at something. Zaire took the folder with the reflexive politeness of a man used to receiving documents and opened it to find a photocopied page from a notary registry, a printed flight itinerary, a stack of credit card receipts from a marine and lodging outfitter, and a photograph of 12 men standing in a gravel lot outside a diner in Newport, Tennessee, time-stamped in the corner. Behind him, I noticed Gwen leaning slightly to see what he held, her expression tightening with a confusion that looked entirely genuine. Those documents establish where I was on June the 14th, I said. On a road rally through Kentucky and Tennessee in the company of 11 other men, one of whom happens to be a licensed notary public named Zane Pittman, third from the left in that photograph. I did not appear before any notary in Ohio that day. I was 400 miles away, eating lunch at a diner, while your document claims I stood in front of a Knox County stamp and signed away my shop and my house. Zaire's face did something complicated, the color not draining, so much as settling into a different arrangement, and his eyes moved from the photograph to the flight receipts to Cohen, who had not moved from the center of the room, his jaw set in the particular way I remembered from when he was 9 years old, and I would not let him quit Little League partway through a season. The notary on this document, I continued, is a man named Gerald Voss, whose credentials, according to the Ohio Secretary of State's registry, were reported stolen from a strip mall office in Springfield 11 months ago. He has never met me. He has certainly never watched me sign anything, because on the day in question, he was, as far as anyone can determine, nowhere near Knox County either. Cohen Zaire said, his voice cracking. You told me the father had no way to contest this. You told me this was clean. Shut up, Cohen said, flat and final. That is not an answer, I said, keeping my voice level, the same tone I had used with Giovanna 2 nights earlier when a decision needed to be made cleanly and without drama. Zaire, you drafted a legal instrument using a stolen notary seal to transfer a 45-year-old family business and the home I raised my son in. That is not a documentation error. That is a federal crime. And you committed it believing the man on the other end of it would be too confused or too frightened to fight back. I want a lawyer, Zaire said, his voice thin now, the portfolio slipping slightly in his grip. You will have every opportunity for that, I said. But first, I think it is time everyone in this room heard exactly what I have been listening to for the past 5 nights. I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew my phone already connected through a small speaker I had set up on the side table the evening before, and I looked at Cohen, who had gone very still the way a man goes still when he finally understands that the ground beneath him has already shifted, and there is nothing left to do but wait for the sound of it giving way completely. I pressed play. Cohen's voice filled the living room flat and unhurried, carried through the small speaker with a clarity that left no room for anyone to later claim they had misheard. Monday is confirmed. 8 in the morning. Transport arrives at the house. The old man thinks he is signing over to a standard placement. He will not resist. Zaire's head came up sharply, the folder nearly slipping from his hands entirely, and the facility, Zaire's own recorded voice, answered thinner through the speaker, but unmistakably his. Everything squared away on their end. $2,000 deposit wired last week through the holding account. Cohen's recorded voice continued. They confirmed receipt. Room's ready whenever we need it. I watched Gwen's face change in real time. Watched the specific horror of recognizing a voice come apart across her features, and she took one step backward until she bumped against the entry table, her hand flying to her mouth. The recording moved forward without pause into the section I had listened to alone in my dark office 5 nights earlier. Cohen's voice describing the sedation protocol, the cardiac events that were common, the death certificates filed as natural causes, no autopsy requested, no police involvement, the whole operation built to produce that outcome cleanly. Oh God, Zaire said, not loudly, just the involuntary sound of a man watching the floor of his own life open beneath him. Oh God, Cohen, what did you tell me I was part of? Cohen did not answer him. Cohen stood in the center of my living room with his hands loose at his sides and his face arranged into something I recognized from every negotiation I had ever watched him conduct at family gatherings. The rigid composure of a man deciding that the correct response to being caught was to perform calm until something changed in his favor. The recording continued into the insurance section. Cohen's voice explaining the $9 million policy, the private Delaware underwriter, the fabricated medical evaluations, the 60-day payout window following a documented death in a licensed care facility. And then, unmistakably, the line that had cost me the most to hear the first time. "She does not know about any of this," Zaire's recorded voice said. "Not really. She knows what she needs to know." Cohen's recorded voice answered, "She signs what I put in front of her, and she does not ask the right questions. That is what I need her to be right now. A functional piece of the structure." Gwen made a sound I will remember for the rest of my life. Not quite a sob, not quite a scream, the particular noise of someone understanding all at once, and without the mercy of gradual revelation, the full shape of what had been built around her. Her knees buckled and she caught herself against the entry table, her breath coming in short, broken pulls. I did not go to her. I stood exactly where I was, the way I had planned to stand, because there was one more thing this room needed to hear before anyone moved. I reached forward and pressed the second button on my phone, and the front door opened behind me without a knock this time. Special Agent Alana Shaw entered first, her badge already visible on her belt, followed by Agent Christopher Calhoun and two additional officers I had met only briefly that morning. And the effect on Zaire Glenn was immediate and total. His knees did not buckle the way Gwen's had, but they considered it, and he sat down hard in the armchair behind him, the folder finally sliding from his fingers onto the floor. "Zaire Glenn, Agent Shaw said you are under arrest for wire fraud, identity fraud, in connection with the misappropriation of notary credentials and forgery of a legal instrument. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." "I want to cooperate," Zaire said, the words coming fast and unguarded, now the particular relief of a man who has decided cooperation is the only door left open to him. "I have everything, text messages, emails, a full record of every communication with him. I will hand over all of it. I did not know what the facility actually was, not the way it really was. I swear to you, I did not know." Agent Calhoun helped him to his feet and guided him toward the front door, and Zaire went without resistance, leaving the folder and its photographs scattered across my living room floor like evidence of something. Because that was exactly what it was. Cohen did not move. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the remaining agent, at Gwen, still shaking against the entry table, at the empty armchair with the rigid chin-forward posture of a man who had decided that the correct response to watching his accomplice collapse was to perform confidence until the performance itself became indistinguishable from strength. "You have nothing that touches me directly," he said, his voice steady, almost bored, almost rehearsed. Zaire drafted the documents. Zaire stole the notary seal. Whatever he panics into saying in an interview room is not evidence of anything I personally did. I looked at my son, standing in the middle of the room where I had raised him in the house he had tried to steal out from under me 8 days after his own wedding. And I felt something settle into place that had been building for 5 days. "There is one more thing you should know," I said. Cohen's eyes narrowed slightly, the first genuine crack of uncertainty I had seen in him since he stepped through my front door this morning, still believing the visit would end with him holding the keys to everything I had spent 45 years building. "The Detroit Syndicate," I said. "The $4.1 million you owe them. The payment that was due this morning before their collection process activates." Something shifted behind his eyes, fast and involuntary. The particular look of a man who has just heard a detail no outsider should have known. "How do you know about that?" he said. And for the first time, his voice had lost the careful evenness he had been holding on to since the agents walked in. "Because I bought it," I said. 2 nights ago, while you were finalizing arrangements with a facility outside Springfield, my financial team contacted the syndicate through a series of intermediary corporations and offered a full buyout of your entire debt. Principal plus accrued interest. $4.1 million wired in full. They accepted. The assignment paperwork was signed and executed before sunrise the following morning. Cohen did not move, but something in his posture had changed, a stiffness settling into his shoulders that had not been there a moment earlier. "You do not have that kind of money," he said, though the words came out without any real force behind them, more reflex than conviction. The sound of a man testing whether the ground beneath him was actually as solid as it looked. "Your mother spent 22 years developing medical imaging patents," I said. "When she sold the licensing rights to a pharmaceutical partnership in the year you turned 18, the proceeds went into a private trust. $115 million, managed carefully, held quietly in my name, exactly the way she wanted it." I let that number settle into the room, the way I had let it settle into my own chest 5 days earlier. "You spent months investigating my finances, Cohen. You looked at a checking account with $60,000 in it and a modest pension deposit, and you decided you had found the entire picture. You never once looked at what your mother actually built." Cohen's face had gone the particular color of a man whose blood has stopped moving the way it is supposed to, the color draining from his hairline downward, and he sat down slowly on the arm of the sofa, not deliberately, his legs simply ceasing to hold up the version of himself he had been performing since he walked through my door. "The promissory notes are in default," I continued. "You missed this morning's payment. Under the terms of the original loan agreement, which I now hold in full, that default triggers immediate acceleration of the entire outstanding balance and authorizes the creditor, which is now a holding corporation I control through the Lester Family Trust, to initiate asset seizure proceedings. Your accounts are already frozen. Your brokerage firm, such as it actually is, has been flagged for federal review, given what the forensic team found regarding its client activity." Gwen had gone still against the entry table, watching this unfold with an expression that had moved past shock into something more like exhaustion. The particular stillness of a person who has run out of new ways to be surprised. "The life insurance policy," I said. $9 million taken out on my life using a forged power of attorney and fabricated medical evaluations. The underwriter has already been notified this morning of the fraud. The policy is void. There will be no payout, ever, regardless of what happens to me, which means the only path you built to solve your problems no longer exists." Cohen looked up at me from where he sat on the arm of the sofa, and for one brief moment, something moved across his face that I had not seen there in years. Not since he was small enough to still believe I could fix anything that broke. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something harder, more calculating. The look of a man already trying to determine what pieces of his life might still be salvageable. "You planned all of this," he said quietly. "The recording, the debt, all of it. I spent 45 years learning to listen for the sound of something about to fail before it actually breaks," I said. "I did not plan to catch you, Cohen. I simply refused to stop paying attention once I noticed the sound." Agent Shaw stepped forward, then her voice, carrying the same flat procedural authority she had used with Zaire minutes earlier. "Cohen Lester, you are under arrest for wire fraud, elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney, and if you cannot afford one, one will be appointed for you." "I want to call my attorney," Cohen said, and his voice had finally lost the last of its performance, gone flat and small in a way I had never heard from him before. "You will have that opportunity," Agent Shaw said, and Agent Calhoun stepped forward and guided him toward the door. As they passed the entry table, Cohen's eyes found mine one final time, and whatever I saw there was not remorse, not yet. It was something closer to a man doing arithmetic on a life that no longer added up the way he had always assumed it would. The front door closed behind them, and the living room went quiet in a way that felt almost physical, the particular silence that settles into a space after something enormous has finally finished happening. Agent Calhoun's footsteps faded on the porch steps outside, and through the front window, I could see the dark blue sedan pulling away from the curb, taking my son somewhere I would not be able to follow him for a long while. Gwen had not moved from her position against the entry table. She stood there, with her arms wrapped around herself, her light jacket, doing nothing against whatever cold had settled into her from the inside out. And she was staring at the empty space in the middle of the room where Cohen had been standing only moments earlier. as if some part of her still expected him to materialize there and explain that all of it had been a misunderstanding. "Gwen," I said gently, and she flinched at the sound of her own name, her eyes coming up to meet mine slowly, the way a person surfaces from deep water. "I did not know," she said, her voice cracking on the third word. "I swear to you, Dad, I did not know any of that. Not the facility, not the sedation, not any of it. He told me it was a nice place. He showed me photographs of a garden, a dining room. I believed him because I wanted to believe him." "I know," I said. "I knew about the money trouble," she went on. The words coming faster now, tumbling out of her, the way things do once a person finally stops holding them back. I knew he was stressed about something. I just did not know how bad it actually was. "I signed papers, Dad. I do not even know how many. He would put things in front of me and tell me it was standard paperwork. For the business, refinancing, routine stuff. And I signed because I trusted him. Because he was my husband. Because I did not think a person could smile at you across breakfast and be planning something like this underneath it." Her voice broke completely on the last few words, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, her shoulders beginning to shake, with the particular helpless rhythm of someone who has been holding something in for far too long and has finally run out of strength to keep holding it. I crossed the room and stood near her, not touching her, giving her the space to decide for herself whether she wanted to be closer, and after a moment, she stepped forward and let herself lean just slightly against my shoulder, the way she used to when she was younger, and something at school had gone badly, and she needed somewhere safe to stand for a minute before facing the world again. "I want to talk to the agents," she said, once her breathing had steadied. "I have access to his email accounts. I know the passwords to some of the offshore accounts because I helped set up the online banking 2 years ago, before I understood what any of it actually meant. I have copies of documents on my own laptop that I printed out because something felt wrong even when I could not name what it was. I want to give them everything." "That is your decision to make," I said, "not mine." "I know," she said, "but I wanted you to hear me say it before I do it. I do not want you to find out later and wonder whether I was still protecting him." I looked at my daughter-in-law, this young woman who had grown up 2 streets over, who used to ride her bicycle past my shop, asking questions about carburetors nobody her age should have cared about, who had married my son 8 days before he tried to steal my entire life out from under me. And I understood that whatever guilt she was carrying, she had not built the structure that trapped her inside it. She had simply trusted the wrong architect. "You are not responsible for what he did," I said. "You are responsible for what you do next. That is the only part that was ever actually yours to control." Gwen wiped her face with the back of her wrist and nodded, and something in her posture straightened slightly. The particular recovery of a person who has decided to stop drowning and start swimming instead. Agent Shaw reappeared in the doorway then, having stepped outside briefly to coordinate with the officers escorting Cohen and Zaire. And she looked between the two of us with the careful, measured attention of someone who had watched 100 family collapses and understood that each one required its own particular handling. "Mrs. Lester," she said to Gwen, "I understand you may have relevant information." "I do," Gwen said, her voice steadier now than it had been at any point that morning. "I want to cooperate fully. I want to do it today while I still have the nerve to go through with it." Agent Shaw nodded, and something in her expression, brief and professional, but not unkind, suggested she recognized the particular courage it took for a person to volunteer to dismantle their own marriage in front of federal investigators, especially only minutes after watching it collapse in the first place. "We will need you to come to the field office," Agent Shaw said, "today, if you are ready." "I am ready," Gwen said, and she looked at me one final time before she followed the agent toward the door. And whatever passed between us in that look did not need words. The particular recognition of 2 people who had both just arrived at the same painful truth from entirely different directions. Giovanna called just after noon to confirm what I already understood from the quiet that had settled over my house once the last car pulled away. The asset seizure filings were processing through the county recorder's office. The fraudulent deed transfer had already been flagged and would be formally voided by end of day, with the road rally evidence and Zane Pittman's sworn statement attached as supporting documentation. My house and my shop had never actually stopped belonging to me, not for one single day, regardless of what a stolen notary seal had tried to claim otherwise. I changed out of the suit that afternoon, sliding Marie's letter free from the breast pocket, before I hung the jacket carefully back in its garment bag, and drove to the shop the way I had driven there nearly every day for 45 years. Except this time, the drive felt different, lighter somehow, though I could not have explained exactly why, given everything that had just happened. Perhaps it was simply the particular relief of a threat finally named and dealt with, rather than the absence of any threat at all. The shop was quiet when I let myself in, the afternoon light slanting low and gold through the front windows, the way it always did this time of day in July, catching dust in the air the way it had caught dust for 4.5 decades. I walked past the parts counter, past the bay where a customer's transmission still sat half-assembled, and back to the corner where the Mustang waited exactly where it always waited, patient in the particular way that only inanimate things can afford to be patient. I pulled a stool over and sat down beside it, running my hand along the curve of the front fender, the metal warm from the afternoon sun coming through the high windows. Marie had bought this car the summer Cohen turned 10, rust-eaten clean through the floor pans, the engine seized solid. And she had stood in this very spot with her hands on her hips, surveying the wreck of it, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who saw potential where other people saw only scrap. "We are going to fix this together," she had told me. "When I retire, you and me, one piece at a time." We had gotten as far as we had gotten. The body work was done. The frame reinforced the interior, stripped and ready for new upholstery she had picked out from a swatch book 3 summers before she got sick. A deep burgundy that matched. She had pointed out the exact color of the roses along our back fence. The engine sat disassembled on a stand nearby, most of it rebuilt, waiting for a final push that had never come. Because grief, I had learned, does not leave room for finishing things. It only leaves room for maintaining what is already finished, tending what still needs tending, and letting everything else sit exactly where it was the day the world changed. I took Marie's letter from my shirt pocket where I had slipped it before leaving the house and unfolded it one final time in the gold afternoon light of the shop where she had spent so many Saturday afternoons keeping me company while I worked sitting on this exact stool with a paperback novel and a thermos of coffee, content simply to be near the sound of tools and engines and a man doing work he loved. The people who truly love you will never need to convince you to doubt your own mind. I read again, though I had the words memorized by now, could have recited them standing in the dark with my eyes closed. You have spent your whole life reading metal for the truth other people could not see. Trust that same eye when it comes to people. I had trusted that eye. It had cost me a great deal to trust it more than I would have chosen if choosing had been available to me. But it had also saved my life in the most literal sense a person can mean those words. I looked at the Mustang 3/4 finished, waiting the way it had waited for 5 years for hands that had not been ready to finish it without her. I think it is time I said out loud to the empty shop, to the dust-catching gold light, to whatever part of Marie still lingered in a place she had loved as much as any room in our house. "I think I am ready now." I heard footsteps then, careful and slow on the concrete floor near the front entrance, and I turned on my stool to find Gwen standing just inside the doorway, still wearing the same light jacket from that morning, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. The particular steadiness of a person who has spent an entire afternoon telling federal investigators the truth, and has come out the other side of it changed. "I did not know you were here," I said. "I thought you would still be at the field office." "I was," she said. "I gave them everything. Statements, passwords, copies of every document I could find. Agent Shaw said it would take most of the day to go through it all, but they let me go for now." She stepped further into the shop, her eyes moving past me to the Mustang, taking in the burgundy swatch still pinned to the dashboard, the disassembled engine waiting patiently on its stand. "I did not know this was still here," she said quietly. "I did not know you had never finished it." "I have not been ready," I said. "Until today, I think." Gwen walked closer, her sneakers quiet against the concrete floor, and stopped a few feet from the Mustang, studying it the way a person studies something they are only now understanding they had never fully seen before, despite having been part of this family for 3 years. "Can I sit?" she asked, gesturing toward the empty stool near the workbench. "Of course," I said. She pulled the stool over and sat close enough that I could see the exhaustion sitting heavy under her eyes. The particular tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from an entire day spent rebuilding a version of your own life out of pieces you did not know were broken until someone else pointed at them. I keep thinking about all the small things she said, looking at her hands rather than at me. Dinners where he would get a call and step outside for 20 minutes. Nights he came home late and told me it was client meetings, business dinners that ran long. I believed every single one of those explanations, Dad, because I did not have a single reason to think my husband was capable of any of this. And now I keep replaying all of it, wondering how many of the small lies I simply never noticed because I was not looking for them. You were not looking for them, I said, because a marriage is not supposed to require that kind of looking. Trust is not a failure of attention. It is the entire point of loving someone. She was quiet for a moment, turning that over. I told the agents everything I could remember, she said, eventually. Dates, conversations, the accounts I helped set up without understanding what they were actually for. I do not know if any of it will matter legally, but I wanted it on the record that I asked questions when something felt wrong, even if he always had an answer ready. That matters, I said. Not just legally, it matters that you asked. I reached into my shirt pocket and withdrew Marie's letter, unfolded now, more times than I could count, the creases gone soft with handling, and I held it out toward her. I want you to read this, I said. Gwen took it carefully, the way a person takes something they understand is fragile, and she read it slowly, her eyes moving down the page, line by line, and I watched her throat work once, twice, as she reached the lines near the bottom. She wrote this before she died. Gwen said when she finished, her voice thick, 4 months before. She gave it to me in the hospital room, I said. Told me it was not a goodbye. Just some things she wanted me to have in writing for when I needed them. I have read it more times this past week than in the 5 years before it. Gwen folded the letter carefully along its worn creases and handed it back to me. And for a moment, neither of us said anything. The only sound in the shop, the low tick of the metal roof settling as the afternoon heat began to ease. She would have liked you, I said, Marie. She had a way of seeing people clearly, the same way she saw problems clearly, straight through whatever version of themselves they were showing the world. She would have seen the person who used to ride her bicycle past this shop, asking questions about carburetors nobody your age should have cared about, and she would have handed you a rag and put you to work before you finished the question. Gwen's eyes filled, and this time she let the tears come without fighting them. Quiet and unhurried, the particular crying of someone who has finally reached a place safe enough to stop holding everything together at once. I am sorry, she said, for all of it, for not seeing what was happening under my own roof, for every moment I chose comfort over asking harder questions. You are here now, I said. That is the part that matters. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket and looked at the Mustang again, at the burgundy swatch still pinned above the dashboard, at the disassembled engine, waiting on its stand for hands willing to finish what had been started. Would you let me help, she asked, with this? I do not know the first thing about engines, but I could learn. I would like to be here for it, if that is something you would want. I looked at my daughter-in-law, sitting on Marie's old stool, in the gold light of a shop that had nearly been stolen out from under both of us, offering to spend her weekends learning a craft that had nothing to do with anything Cohen had ever valued or understood. And I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for longer than the past 5 days alone. I would like that very much, I said. Marie always said the shop needed more people in it who actually wanted to be there. Gwen smiled then, small and uncertain, but real, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since she walked through my front door that morning, with guilt and relief arriving on her face at exactly the same time. Where do we start, she asked, and something in her voice sounded younger than it had all day, closer to the girl who used to ask me questions on her bicycle than the woman who had spent her afternoon in a federal interview room. I reached over and picked up a socket wrench from the tray beside the engine stand, the metal cool and familiar in my palm, and I held it out to her. Here, I said. We start here. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm I had not expected to find again. Not after everything, but there it was, anyway, steady and unhurried. The particular kind of rhythm that only comes from working with your hands towards something that matters. Gwen came to the shop most evenings after her shift at the hospital pharmacy, still in her scrubs. Sometimes her hair pulled back the same practical way it had been the morning she stood in my doorway, with relief and guilt arriving on her face together. She was clumsy at first, the way anyone is clumsy learning a new language, holding wrenches wrong, stripping a bolt head on her second week because she turned it the wrong direction under too much pressure, apologizing so thoroughly for the mistake that I had to remind her twice that stripped bolts were simply the tuition every mechanic pays on the way to competence. By the third week, she had stopped apologizing for the mistakes and started asking better questions instead, which I had learned over 45 years of teaching apprentices was the actual marker of someone who intended to stay. We rebuilt the carburetor together on a Tuesday evening in early August. The shop radio tuned to the same country station it had been tuned to for decades. And Gwen held each component up to the light, the way I taught her, checking for the hairline cracks that do not announce themselves to anyone not specifically looking for them. You look for the wrongness the same way you looked for it in that signature, she said at one point, turning a float valve over in her fingers. Same eye, I told her. Different metal. The insurance underwriter formally voided the fraudulent policy in the second week of August. A letter arriving with language so clinical, it managed to describe the collapse of an attempted murder plot in the same flat tone a bank uses to announce a change in overdraft fees. Giovanna called to confirm that the asset seizure against Cohen's remaining accounts had cleared, that his brokerage license was under federal review and would almost certainly be revoked before the criminal proceedings even concluded. Zaire Glenn, true to his word in my living room that morning, had handed over months of documentation, texts, emails, a running ledger of every communication between himself and Cohen regarding the forged transfer and the arrangement with the facility outside Springfield. His cooperation, Giovanna told me, was likely to earn him a significantly reduced sentence. Though reduced in a case built on forgery and conspiracy to commit murder, was a relative term. Cohen's court-appointed attorney filed the expected motions challenging the admissibility of the recordings, challenging the road rally evidence, challenging nearly everything that could be challenged on paper, and each motion was denied in turn, methodically, the way a well-built structure withstands pressure. It was designed to withstand. I did not attend the hearings. Giovanna kept me informed, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not need to watch the process unfold in person to feel the particular relief of watching it unfold correctly. Walter Santos came by most weekends, standing in the open bay door with a beer in each hand, watching Gwen and me work with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent 31 years running his own shop and understood exactly what it meant to see one being passed forward instead of torn apart. "Your granddaughter's got good hands," he said one Saturday, watching Gwen carefully torque a bolt to spec, checking the reading twice against the manual, the way I had taught her. "She is my daughter-in-law," I said. Walter shrugged. "Family's family," he said, and went back to his beer, and I did not correct him again. By the last week of August, the engine sat fully reassembled on its stand, every gasket seated, every belt tensioned, the carburetor rebuilt and mounted. The whole system checked and rechecked with a particular thoroughness I brought to anything that mattered enough to get right the first time. Gwen had painted the valve covers herself a deep burgundy that matched the upholstery swatch Marie had pinned to the dashboard 3 summers before she got sick. Close enough to the color of the roses along our back fence that I had to stop and stand still for a moment the first time I saw it dry. "We are going to start it today," I told her, on a Thursday evening, with the shop windows open to let out the heat, the light going gold and long, the way it always did this time of year. Gwen's hands were shaking slightly when she climbed into the driver's seat, and I stood beside the open door, watching her, the way I had watched Cohen learn to check oil on a Camaro in this same garage decades earlier, before ambition and money had replaced whatever used to sit underneath his curiosity. "Turn the key slow," I told her. "Give it a second to prime before you crank it over." She turned the key. The starter motor cycled, caught the engine, and for one long moment, nothing happened at all. Just the mechanical grinding of metal parts, remembering how to move together after 5 years of silence. And then, all at once, the engine turned over and roared to life. Rough for half a second, and then settling into a steady, even idle that filled the entire shop with sound. Gwen let out a laugh that was half sob, both hands still gripping the wheel. And I stood there, in the noise and the exhaust and the particular vibration of an engine running, the way it was always meant to run. And I let myself feel for the first time in longer than I could properly measure. Something that was simply, uncomplicatedly joy. We let the Mustang idle for a long while that evening, longer than it strictly needed to run, both of us simply standing there in the open bay, listening to it. The sound filling the shop the way it had filled countless afternoons decades earlier, when Marie used to sit on that same stool with her paperback and her thermos, content just to be near the noise of something being built correctly. Gwen finally cut the engine, and the quiet that followed felt different than the quiet before. Not empty, the way silence had felt in this shop for 5 years, but full. The particular fullness that comes after a long-held breath finally lets go. I had been thinking about something I told her once. The shop had settled back into its evening stillness, the light gone from gold to a deeper amber through the high windows. About what actually happened here and what I want to take from it. Gwen wiped her hands on a rag and leaned against the fender, waiting. I spent 72 years being the quiet man in the room, I said. The one who fixed things without announcing it, who loved people without performing it for an audience. And I think somewhere along the way, my own son mistook that quiet for something else. Mistook it for weakness or foolishness, or a mind slow enough to talk circles around. That mistake cost him everything he had. Do you think he ever really believed that, Gwen asked? That you were foolish? I think he needed to believe it, I said. A man does not do what Cohen did to someone he genuinely respects. He has to first convince himself that the person deserves what is coming, that they are somehow less than fully capable, less than fully deserving of the truth. It is easier to steal from a fool than from a father, so he built the fool first, piece by piece. The gas leak, the whispered concerns, the careful little performances. And then he tried to steal from the fool he had built, rather than the man who actually raised him. Gwen was quiet for a moment, considering that. The people who genuinely love you, I said, will never need to convince you to doubt your own mind. Marie wrote me those words 4 months before she died, and I did not fully understand what she meant by them until a stranger with a stolen notary seal showed up on my porch with a stack of forged paper. If someone is working hard to make you question your own memory, your own judgment, your own eyes, that effort itself is the warning. Trust what you know. Do not let anyone talk you out of your own mind for their convenience. I had thought about that too, Gwen said quietly. How much easier it was for him when I stopped asking questions. How much smoother everything went once I decided trusting him meant not looking too closely. Trust and blindness are not the same thing, I said. I trusted Cohen for 38 years, and that trust was not foolish. It was simply misplaced. In the end, on a person who stopped deserving it somewhere along the way, without telling me. The mistake was never trusting. The mistake would have been staying blind after the evidence started arriving. Gwen nodded slowly, turning that over the way she had learned to turn over an engine problem, looking at it from every angle before deciding what it actually meant. I keep coming back to the shop, I said, looking around at the bays, at the tools hung in their places, at the Mustang, sitting finished now for the first time in 5 years. Cohen looked at all of this and saw square footage. He saw a number on a piece of paper, an asset to be liquidated for whatever he needed it to become. He never once, in all the years he grew up in these bays, understood that the actual value was never in what the building was worth. It was in what got built inside it. Relationships, skill passed from one set of hands to another. A woman with a thermos and a paperback, content simply to be near the sound of honest work. That is not something you can put a number on, Gwen said. No, I said, and that is exactly why he could not see it. A man who has learned to price everything eventually loses the ability to recognize the things that were never for sale in the first place. I walked to the workbench and picked up the rag Gwen had set down, wiping a smear of grease from my own hands out of old habit. The motion so familiar it required no thought at all after 45 years of repetition. Greed does not announce itself, I said. It arrives slowly, dressed up as concern, speaking the language of love, while quietly counting everything you own. I did not see it coming from my own son, not clearly, not until it was standing on my porch with a lawyer and a countdown clock. I do not say that to frighten you. I say it because the most dangerous thing in any of our lives is rarely a stranger. It is usually someone who has learned exactly how much we trust them and decided to spend that trust like currency. Gwen looked at the Mustang at the burgundy paint, still slightly tacky in places at the reflection of both of us, caught faintly in the polished hood. "So what do we do with that?" she asked, knowing it. "We keep building things anyway," I said, carefully, with people who have earned the right to stand this close to what we are making. That is the only answer I have ever found that actually holds up under pressure. Gwen left a little after 9 that night, promising to come back Saturday to help me flush the brake lines before we took the Mustang out for its first real drive. And I stood alone in the shop for a while after her car pulled out of the lot, listening to the particular quiet that settles into a space once the people who filled it with noise have finally gone home. I walked over and ran my hand along the hood one more time, the paint still faintly warm from the day's heat. And I thought about how strange it was that the thing which had nearly cost me everything, my own quiet trust in the people closest to me, was the very same thing that had let Marie and me build a life worth defending in the first place. Trust is not the mistake. It never was. The mistake is only ever failing to notice when someone stops deserving it. People have asked me in the weeks since what I actually learned from all of this. I have had time to think about the honest answer, standing in this shop most evenings with the radio playing and the smell of solvent and hot metal in the air. And here is what I keep coming back to. Silence is not the same thing as weakness. I spent 72 years being the quiet man in the room, the one who fixed what was broken without making a show of it, who loved the people in my life without needing them to watch me do it. My own son mistook that quiet for something he could exploit, and that mistake cost him a business, a marriage, and very nearly his freedom. Being underestimated is not always a wound. Sometimes it is simply the space you need to see clearly what everyone else has missed. I learned that the people who genuinely love you will never need to convince you to doubt your own mind. If someone in your life is working hard to make you question your own memory, your own judgment, your own eyes, pay close attention to that effort itself, because the effort is the warning long before the harm ever arrives. Trust what you know. You built a life out of decades of small, steady choices. Do not let anyone talk you out of your own good sense for their own convenience. Here is my honest opinion, for whatever it is worth, from a man who spent his career under the hood of other people's engines. Greed does not knock on your door wearing a mask. It arrives dressed as concern, speaking the language of love, asking polite questions at Christmas dinner about patents you never talk about, showing up with takeout on a Wednesday afternoon just to send you out to the garage for 20 minutes. I have seen it up close, now closer than I ever wanted to, and I will tell you plainly. The most dangerous person in your life is rarely a stranger. It is someone who has spent years learning exactly how much you trust them and quietly deciding how to spend it. So call the people you love. Call them without needing a reason. Show up at their door sometimes without an occasion attached to it. Presence is the only kind of proof that cannot be forged, no matter how good someone gets at copying a signature. I think about Marie often in this shop, sitting on that stool with her paperback and her thermos, content simply to be near the sound of honest work. I think she would have liked watching Gwen learn to torque a bolt to spec, checking the reading twice against the manual the way I taught her. I think she would have said in that dry way she had that it took long enough for someone in this family to actually want to be here. The Mustang runs now. 5 years after she bought it as a wreck with the floor pans rusted clean through, 5 years after I could not bring myself to finish something that had been ours. It sits in the corner bay with a burgundy interior that matches the roses along our back fence, waiting for its first real drive, which Gwen and I have already promised each other we will take together. Top down the moment the brake lines are finished. If this story reached something in you, something honest about trust, about the people we let close enough to hurt us, I would ask you to sit with that for a moment before you scroll away. Think about who in your own life has never once needed you to doubt yourself in order to love them well. Call that person tonight, even if you do not have particular news to share. And if you found any value in these 2 hours we have spent together, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from, because I read every single one, And I would like to know that this story found its way to people who needed to hear it as much as I once needed to live it. Subscribe if you would like to hear the next one. There are more stories like this waiting to be told about ordinary people who turned out to be sturdier than anyone, including themselves, ever gave them credit for. Thank you truly for staying until the very end. Some of the details in this story have been shaped for the sake of the telling, but everything it tries to teach you is worth carrying with you long after the engine goes quiet.